Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 25th episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today, we are going to have a discussion about the Green New Deal. And I thought I'd give a little background and maybe share a few thoughts. And then Matt can chime in and we'll go from there. So, the Green New Deal was not a piece of legislation, just to be clear. I think some people get a bit confused about that. It's a resolution. It's a non-binding resolution that Alexandria-Ocasio-Cortez and another person whose name I'm blanking on released. And so you could say, well, if it's not a piece of legislation, why does it matter? But it's meant to begin a conversation on two things, on climate change and on income inequality. And now AOC would say that those two things are linked. So you have to focus on solving both of them at once. Basically, you have to juggle two things at once. And I think generally speaking, I would say I'm for the Green New Deal. Now, because it's not a piece of binding legislation, obviously other steps have to be taken. I mean, as AOC said in a conversation that we both watched, my co-host and I, the day after the Green New Deal happens, nothing. I mean, a lot of things have to happen afterwards. But I think it's a good first step because I think those two issues do need to be addressed. And I think that it's right to address them simultaneously because it's addressing both the economic aspects of human life, but it's also addressing the fact that we need to make sure that we live on that the environment we live in is sustainable and healthy. I just wanted to read a few things. I was actually looking through the notes. I took a geology class last semester. I'm a college student, in case anyone doesn't know that. I took a geology class last semester, and we went over climate change a little. So I was looking through my notes. I wanted just to jot down a few or speak about a few things having to do with climate change, and then I'll let my co-host jump in here. So climate change is causing various things. It's causing the air temperature to increase, the water temperature to increase, the sea level to increase. It's causing precipitation changes, disease, ocean acidification, and animal extinction. So, for example, species are going extinct at a rate 1,000 times faster than they did prior to humans. And then increase in acidity in the ocean is occurring due to an uptake of carbon dioxide in the oceans, which is obviously detrimental to the life in the ocean itself. But think about it, sea levels rising. That means that coastal areas are going to be hit, or that coastal areas could become uninhabitable. So all of these things are happening because of an increase in global temperature. So it's and also in my notes it said the global global temperatures have increased all of that could happen with an increase in 1.5 degrees overall globally. And then more of that's also going to happen in the 21st century because it's predicted that about another 2 degrees Celsius will, the Earth's temperature will increase about 2 degrees Celsius in this century. So I just wanted to begin the conversation with that all in our minds. People, it's easy to make fun of certain kinds of environmentalists that are saying things like, "Oh, it's the end of the world." Even AOC, I think, made the point. She said something like, "It's gonna, in 10 or 12 years, the world's gonna end if we don't do something." But we also have to acknowledge that climate change is an existential problem. It might not be the quote-unquote end of the world, but it is a serious problem with a lot of ramifications. And if we don't do something, the human cost alone, if we even put aside all the cost to the other species, the human cost alone will be astounding. So I guess I'll let my co-host jump in here. I realize I didn't talk about income inequality yet, but I think we'll get to that as well.
Yeah, so I think I'll give some thoughts based on what you just said, and they're kind of general thoughts that I've had on the topic, and then maybe we can dive more into the specific, like, I guess the more specific takeaways from the plan itself. So one thing I kind of would want to put before my statements is anything I say isn't meant to be misconstrued as defending Republicans, because that's not the business I'm in. Although, since I'm going to likely be a detractor of most of the things we talk about, it might be construed that way. But I've never really been satisfied with a lot of the points they've made. So I don't think if somebody responded with, well, the argument you make, Matt, well, there aren't any representatives making that point, I don't really think that's relevant. But I did want to state that from the front. So one thing that you're pointing out is a lot of these problems that are as a result generally of climate change. I think it ends up underlying it kind of ends up underlying my specific takeaways from a lot of the policies we're hearing and a lot of the suggestions you hear from the mainstream left, in the sense that I think they are taking a lot of issues that are all in the same, I guess, spectrum of problems, and they're kind of coalescing them together and almost trying to find a blunt instrument that they can use to fix it. And I find that kind of concerning, and I think we might delve into that a bit more in a little bit. But as you say, like in some cases there's a bunch of animals going extinct. In some cases there are things happening specifically to the ocean, whether it's because the ocean levels are rising or it's because the ocean's becoming more polluted. There's all these separate issues involving the same thing. And I think that's an important thing I'm going to kind of harken back to, because one of my biggest pet peeves with this topic, and I've heard this said from AOC, and I heard this in Naomi Klein's recent book, is since this is a collective problem because it affects all of humanity, therefore it requires collective action. And at this point, I'm not convinced that's anything more than just assertion, and not a statement that can really be defended beyond that. And that's going to be a lot of the points I make. But I do think there needs to be something done with the environment. I mean, a lot of things are happening that are detrimental. But the other thing I would, I guess, add in the broad overview is you have to remember that there are a lot of trade-offs, right? So a lot of the time when people talk about it, they imply that their idea is all good or all bad. So like since this thing is green, it is inherently good. But you also have to remember that the reason why we kind of like have historically burned oil and coal is for energy, and you're going to have to remember the consequences of either raising energy prices or lowering the amount of energy we use, because when we think about countries that aren't like the United States, that can be life or death for people in, say, third worlds, right? And I'm not trying to say that as a cheap shot, but that is, you always have to remember opportunity costs. So that's another thing that I think is very present in this specific conversation. And you kind of touched on that at the end. But do we want to delve specifically into income inequality and maybe some parts from some of the videos we watched? Okay. Do you want to lead us in on that?
Well, I don't have a lot of statistics to spout off the top of my head, so I'll just give a general argument you've probably heard me give before, but I don't know what else to say really. So, if you actually, I think what I'll do is I've been looking at. I didn't read it like all the way through, but I skimmed the Green New Deal. And there was a good sentence here. Let me see if I can find it. Forgive me for not having it off the top of my head. But basically, what it is getting at is, and this is a cliche point. Everyone and their grandma has said this. If you watch news shows or political commentary or whatnot, but I don't know where it is. But anyway, the rich keep getting richer. Like the top people economically, the ones that are at the top of that hierarchy, if you will, are making more and more money as time goes on, and the rest of us are making less and less money. And now that's not a question of that's not a question of standard of living so much, because you and I live in the United States, so relatively speaking, we have a high standard of living. But it does make a point that Bill Gates and Elon Musk and George Soros, just to name three people off the top of my head, they, and I don't mean to single them out necessarily, but they and people similar to them have a monumental amount of income. The level of income they have it's almost mind-boggling. And I think what AOC would say and what Bernie Sanders would say, and what Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang would say, and what I would say, is that's unsustainable. You can't have a small group of people having all of that money, and the rest of us getting less and less of it. That is because, and I mean, this goes back, I guess, to some of the debates we've had on capitalism and the free market and whatnot. But I really just think it's a matter of, in some sense, the climate change and income inequality. Like it doesn't even matter the arguments you're making. That they all boil down to, well, if you want to have a nice life, you have to do something about them. And if you don't do something about them, there will be harsh consequences. There will be a human cost, a human cost, which I don't think anyone really wants to see. But we seem inclined to not do anything about those two problems. So I guess I'll let you jump in here.
Okay. So I would push back on a lot of things you said, but one of the reasons why I'm not is because I'm going to be cognizant of time and know that we have a lot to tackle in itself. But one thing that I kind of want to do is I want to talk about the specific way that income inequality relates to the Green New Deal and or environmentalism. So one thing that I guess I want to challenge you to, maybe I want you to make sure that I'm on the right track when I'm trying to describe Alexandria-Ocasio-Cortez's point, is okay. So I have a quote right here, and I'll tie it in. And she made this during the video we watched, where it's her on MSNBC. She had a town hall with can't remember who it is, with one of their main correspondents. And she said early on, she said, quote, "Historically speaking, we have mobilized our economy on war." And then she went on to say, quote, "We will have to mobilize our entire economy around saving ourselves and taking care of this planet." So what I'm perceiving, the play here, I guess, is she sees income inequality as a problem for the reasons you described. Whether I agree with that or not, that's the argument she's saying. She's saying any income inequality is the same brand of problem as of environmental changes, and she sees and she's pretty much perceiving the existential problem of climate change and the environment as something we should just mobilize these resources to attack this problem, right, and resolve it. So she's pretty much saying, hey, this is a problem. Why don't we take that problem, fix it by putting it against this problem? So do you think I'm on the right track there? Okay. So I guess the one thing I want to push back on now, so we don't, because I don't think there's a good way to wrap around it, and I guess I'll challenge you to make the point. Do you think these two topics are inextricably entwined? So are you convinced that you have to address them both at once? Because AOC later makes the point that you have to address them both, and I was not satisfied with her answer. Now, I don't think there's a good case that you have to fight the environment by also simultaneously, fixing income inequality and vice versa. But because her point that she made when she was asked this question was essentially, well, if we fix the environment, we'll still have these big problems with income inequality, and we'd like to fix those too. So I guess I'm asking you if you can make a more convincing point about why they have to be addressed at the same time in the same plan. And then I don't want to make it, I'm actually going to be very transparent right now. If you do make the standard claim that I feel like somebody on your team would make, I kind of have a response that's economics based. So I'm telling you that now, so you don't feel like you've fallen in a trap, but that might kind of happen. But if I'm transparent by it, it's not nefarious. So I'm telling you that ahead of time that might be the case. So on that note, are these two things inextricably entwined?
I think they are inextricably intertwined, and it kind of goes back to something I mentioned before. They both get to a core issue, which is what kind of society, what kind of world do we want to live in? If we don't tackle climate change, then our descendants are going to have it very difficult. Again, it doesn't have to be a day after tomorrow scenario. It doesn't have to be a 2012 scenario. That's a caricature, but it's definitely there's going to be the places that are going to be livable will be drastically decreased. The diseases that we are subjected to and are having to deal with, those will go up. Our ability to raise sustainable crops could be interfered with. And just if we knock out the balance in the biosphere, if enough life goes extinct, then that will be felt by us very strongly. And then, income inequality. Well, what happens if we don't do anything about income inequality? Well, that just means, as I said, that the people at the top, and actually I did finally find the quote. It says in the Green New Deal, quote, the top 1% of earners are accruing 91% of gains in the first few years of economic recovery after the recession. And that's more just a point of kind of in the context, it's kind of saying, okay, this is what happened after the Great Recession, and that shows a that is a illustration of the flaw within our economic system. So if we don't do anything, if we just allow if we just allow this small group of people to acquire all of this wealth, which again, it cost benefit analysis or rather trade off. So if they're getting that wealth, that means someone else is not getting that wealth. The and that will lead that could lead to a I mean, think about all the riots that are going on, for example. People are very angry about a lot of this stuff, so they're going out in the streets in the middle of a pandemic, probably getting a lot of people sick. But that more of that will happen. There will be more riots. There will be more angry people. There will be more property damage. People get. I mean, in income inequality, with situations where there's income inequality, people get desperate, and so in some sense, I could even say to someone like, or to these super rich people, and I could say, well, look, if you want to avoid a disastrous situation, if you want to avoid more people, if you want to avoid people rioting in the streets, you need to do something. We need to redistribute that wealth around, if we want if we want everyone to have a fair shake at this thing we call life. And I guess I'll just add one more point. And this has been made by many people, Gore Vidal, Noam Chomsky, etc. We actually don't have, or what our system is capitalism or free market for the average person, and socialism for the ultra wealthy, socialism for these corporations. And you can say, oh, socialism's bad. But it's almost no wonder that some people are saying, well, maybe we want some socialism for the average person too, when these corporations are being coddled by the government, being given all that money. So it's just a matter of fairness and sustainability.
Okay, so I let you talk about that, but I'm personally not letting this episode be the income inequality episode, because I don't have another hour and a half after this one to record another episode. Or else I would talk about things I disagree with, and then we'd do a double episode like we did a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to clarify what my question was, because I don't necessarily think the broad strokes, what you're saying, is super wrong. Like, I wouldn't push back on all of it. I just push back on some specific parts, and that's what we do when we do a full episode on things. But I guess the question I was trying to ask, and I take complete fault because, like, I guess my question was likely not clear enough or precise enough. It's not about them being the same categories of problems. I was agreeing with you that broadly these two things can be construed as the same category of problem, and that you would still have all those things even if you fixed the climate. I guess what I'm saying is, is it possible to resolve both these problems separately without income inequality having to get fixed at the same time as the climate, and the climate having to get fixed at the same time? Now, I guess what I'm hearing is, well, it would be better if you did them both, because then income inequality will still be a problem. And I'm not hearing that they are inextricably entwined. And I guess I'm going to say, and the reason why I guess I'm going to double down on this point is because I'm not convinced that the best way of fighting climate change is simultaneously the pill to end income inequality. And that, I think that's my economic analysis of the situation based on a lot of things I've read on the Green New Deal and the policy proposals that they're pushing. So I guess I'll go into detail on that. I want to ask a kind of rhetorical question, just so I can kind of get my point out there, and then maybe you can respond to that. So I mentioned to you I'm listening to Naomi Klein's book On Fire, which came out a couple years ago, and it's kind of all about what I think the subtitle is why America needs a Green New Deal or why the world needs a Green New Deal. And I think and she talks a lot about Greta Thunberg in the beginning. And so it's come from that perspective, and that's fine. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear it in detail. So one thing that she says early in the book, after she says that climate change is a collective problem that warrants collective action, she kind of lists several policy proposals that she would suggest. And this is just a start, but kind of 4 things that I jotted down that she specifically mentioned was pretty much mass transit for all, energy efficient housing, smart electrical grids, and then she tacked on increasing research. So the issue that I have with this kind of outlook when they're supporting the Green New Deal is I'm not convinced that the first 3 things I listed there are scalable, remotely cost efficient, or will actually make that much of a difference compared to the real problem, right? So historically, mass transit and light rail has a ton of problems with staying on budget, being remotely cost effective, and it's also a temporary problem, right? So it doesn't really fix income inequality if you spend all this money on a down payment. Then you would still need people to maintain it, but it wouldn't like give these people permanent jobs forever. And then when you're talking about energy efficient housing, you're pretty much saying houses need to be they need to have certain materials, and it's pretty much increasing zoning regulations so houses would be updated, and you could get people out there for a short burst to update housing, and then you have the laws updated, but then it's still just going to be new houses who already have people working on them, right? We'll just outfit them in different ways. And then when it talks about smart electrical grids, it kind of falls in the same category as mass transit. And then when it comes to the research effort, this is where I think the key is. Because right now, wind and solar are a lot of things we talk about, but those aren't necessarily scalable. One of the problems with solar is there's not a good way to store the energy that solar creates. There aren't batteries that effective. So we really do need a lot of research. But when you're talking about income inequality, you're talking about low-skilled workers, right? You're talking mostly about people who got degrees and things that it's hard to find jobs for. And you're not talking about scientists and engineers, right? And I think that the main way to fight this is to, if you're going to use government action, it's to mobilize more scientists and engineers to specifically focus on this problem and unique ways to fight it. It doesn't seem like a problem that, oh yes, we can mobilize low-skilled workers to do the kind of inefficient end for a short period of time. I'm not convinced that would create more jobs. And one thing that I constantly hear is there's all these oil jobs we'll get rid of, and then they can do this instead. Okay, well then they do this instead. You're just taking people with current jobs already that already have quote unquote good unionized jobs and giving them different ones. You're not actually changing anything when you're moving one from one sector to this new cleaner sector. So I think that even cuts further against the argument that it would actually fix the income inequality problem. So I guess I wasn't laying the groundwork so I could say income inequality is dumb. I'm more laying the groundwork to say I don't think the policy solutions will fix income inequality. And I think if they will, it'll be because people are doing things that are known to be very inefficient, but it's something to have people do. So I threw that at you. Republicans don't really say that, right? So that might be a novel argument, but I want to hear some of your reactions to that.
Okay, so I think I understand the question now. You're basically asking, do the policies that are fighting for a greener society, do they correspond with maybe policies that we're fighting for income inequality? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I guess the short version of my argument is the most important jobs for these green movements are already high-skilled jobs that are good jobs. And a lot of the jobs they talk about being new good jobs are also need to reallocate people in oil industries. And I'm not even convinced there will be a lot of them. And even if there are a lot of those jobs, I'm not even convinced those are the efficient ones of this movement, right? I think these are the most inefficient ones because they're these very, very small changes, and they're typically one-time projects to set it up and then just updating. So yeah, I'm not convinced that it would even follow through, and I'm not convinced that'd be effective either.
Well, that is a those are good objections. So I appreciate you you throwing those out there and helping me to think about them. I think I'm not convinced that these green new jobs would be as ineffective as you seem to think they would be. I mean, because the whole point of trying to relocate people from jobs in coal and jobs in fossil fuels to jobs in greener sectors. The whole point is to get them new skills. The whole point is to retrain them and allow them to expand their career prospects, expand their way of life to empower them to be able to go forth and maybe train more people in those sectors, and to allow them to live in the eventually a world where we don't need fossil fuels, and a world where all power can come from green energy, because that we will get there. Now, people say, well, 10 years, you're out of your mind. I don't really. Again, this Green New Deal, it's not a piece of legislation, so it's not going to be AOC and all these people. They're not saying this is what we have to do, we have to do this or else. They're saying that is the goal we are heading towards. This is the road we're on. This is the road we're driving down, and we need to stay on that road and stay on that course, and we'll try to get there in approximately 10 years. We might not exactly do that, but we're trying to get there. I mean, and this is coming, right? I mean, it's not this isn't some crazy fantasy that, we're never going to get to a green, we're never going to get to a society without fossil fuels. It has to be that way. That is just the way the future is going to be. And you can say, well, the market's going to take care of that. Well, at some level, it doesn't matter to me whether you're saying the government's going to do it or the market's going to do it. It's going to get done. Yes.
Okay, so I guess I have 2 points building off what you have to say. So I don't disagree that there could potentially be good jobs in the far out future for people that would work in a similar sector from coal and oil, but it's like the opposite, right? It's the clean version of those. And I don't doubt that those jobs would exist. I guess part of my criticism of AOC's plan, though, is she kind of goes on this long riff about how many Americans are underemployed and how many people, just like her, worked as a bartender despite having college degrees. Now, I would wager that if somebody had a 4-year economic degree and then they ended up becoming a miner, right, I would feel like those people doing manual labor now are kind of underemployed. So even if you're creating if you're creating these spades of new jobs, right, that are going to generally go to people who used to be miners and work in oil, I don't see how that serves the cause of all those people who got useless college degrees. That the Green New Deal kind of implies that it wants to help out and give them good jobs. I guess that was kind of the main criticism, because I can understand like somebody saying, yeah, these coal miners learn these new, more clean skills, and they learn it because it's a similar industry, and a lot of these skills could potentially carry over. It's the same ballpark. And I guess that's granting that those become the new dominant technologies, which is something I'm also kind of want to touch on in a bit. But I don't think it necessarily serves these like quote unquote underemployed college grads that she talks about, that are like her, that are 30 and have been working minimum wage jobs.
I think her point, though, is more about, and I don't remember that exact riff she gave, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think AOC's larger point is more about people who get college degrees, but they continue to struggle. They continue to it's not even so much that they're stuck being a bartender or whatever, or being a coal miner. It's that they're a bartender and they're a coal miner, and they're working their butts off. They're full time. They're doing as much as they can, and they're only getting peanuts. So that's I think her overall point. We need to better allocate resources to allow people to have, and this is a slightly different conversation, but I'm interjecting it in here anyway. So we need to allocate resources enough to where people have livable wages. I think that's really AOC's point. It's not. I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think AOC is saying, well, if you got a degree in gender studies, if the Green New Deal gets passed, then we're automatically going to get everyone who got a degree in gender studies. We're going to find a job for you as a professor to teach gender studies, and everyone's going to get the degree, get the job in the degree they studied. I think she's saying we're trying to create a world where people are okay. People have what they need to survive, and they didn't put in all those resources and money to education only to have to take out or have to get food stamps or having to. They're living on the sidelines despite doing what society says you should do so you can get a great job. That's my interpretation of what AOC is trying to do.
Well, that's kind of why I was saying I don't think that this policy even ideally would actually resolve income inequality, and that's why I don't think it's inextricably linked. Because it's like, well, you're saying there's like AOC is saying that there's this large swath of underemployed college grads, but it's like, well, you're either trying to make them engineer techs at a solar plant or to update solar panels or work at a factory. It's like these people aren't the prime resources that want to do this or have the skills needed to do them. So it's like I understand that resources haven't been allocated correctly, and I would probably argue that has something to do with anybody can get a loan for any major when they go to college. But I guess it's just like I don't think the Green New Deal lives up to the hype of actually helping out with income inequality if there's a lot of it. A lot of what somebody would point to as the people who are suffering right now don't really have a slot to fill in her plan if we're looking at it. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, and I had to look this up a couple minutes ago, was, and I think it's an example that kind of illustrates one of my concerns, is there was an episode of Joe Rogan a while ago. I think the guy's been on the show a few times. His name is like, he lives in India, so his name is like Bjon Slot, something like that. He worked, so pretty much what he did is he engineered a device that he puts in these large streams or rivers that flow. So pretty much he found out that most of the rivers in a certain city, a large city in India, flow into the ocean. And the main driver of pollution that goes into the ocean is from these specific rivers. And he was able to engineer a device that filtered out all the trash that was flowing down those rivers because he was able to specifically target these four. So I guess what I'm saying is there are so many problems and there are so many layers to each problem in the environmental crisis. Is I have the concern that not a lot of solutions are scalable, and I have a concern that we haven't found the most efficient responses to a lot of things. So if we lean into solar energy, right? But even though solar panels are historically not good at storing you can't store energy by solar panels. It's just really inefficient. And that's why a lot of people who use solar, it has to be supplemented by dirtier energies because those ones can be scaled up or scaled down to meet the needs of a power grid. So, and if you have an excess of solar energy than what you're using at your house, it just has to go back on the grid because there's no good way to store it. Like this is a huge failing of solar energy. So if we like triple down on solar energy and we decide to allocate a ton of resources specifically to that because it's a more clean job than oil, then we have to accept the trade-offs that come with it. And we have to acknowledge that we're leaning in really hard into a technology that might not end up being nearly the most scalable. So that's why when I think of like more, I guess in my mind, effective solutions, we need to either figure out what can be micro-targeted, like those rivers in India, where it's like one engineer has created this thing that's good at weeding out trash, and he is able to realize, okay, we have these 5 precise points that if we manage, we can reduce how much garbage we're putting in the ocean by a ton, right? So I guess what I'm saying is I'm concerned that a lot of the policy proposals that are pushed, not necessarily by her, because the plan is like an aspirational plan, but given how she wants to tie it in with income inequality, it feels like there's going to be these very broad, sweeping, ideas. And I don't think this is something that can be defeated with like a very broad, sweeping idea. Is that a fair concern to have? I guess because that's one of my big takeaways.
I mean, I think the issue is, I mean, there's the stuff we can do. There's the bigger picture, then there's the smaller, the smaller picture, or so the that particular device, which is put in a couple rivers to decrease the amount of trash that goes into the ocean. That's a great thing. We more money should be invested in that, and that is a step in the right direction. No, I don't think anyone would deny that. But there's the bigger picture. I mean, you can't just say, well, we put this device in a couple rivers, like that's it. We're day's over. That's all the work we need to do. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but this, and I know you disagree with this conceptualization of it, and that's fine, and we can have that discussion. But we do need collective solutions. We do need grand, or we do need big solutions because it is a big problem. Climate change is a big problem, and income inequality is a big problem. I guess I could say a little more about where we disagree in terms of why those issues I do think have to be dealt with at the same time. So I'll just say something quickly. I mean, it goes back again to an earlier point I made, which is it is not what the way our society is set up right now. So, and people, what we like. Let's take standard of living for example. Standard of living is actually going, or not standard of living. Life expectancy. That's what I was trying to say. Life expectancy, because life expectancy is going down. People are actually and we're not. I'm not just talking about. I'm not picking out quotations from some poor third world country and saying, look at that. I'm actually looking at first world countries, very rich countries. Life expectancy is going down. That is unprecedented. There is nothing that was not expected at all. It's supposed to be life expectancy is pretty much supposed to go up and up and up until I guess it gets to the however long humans can live, 100 years, 90 years or so, and then it's assumed to plateau a little bit. We can't go on living indefinitely, but people, like my mom's age, can probably expect to live longer than people my age or the age of my nieces. And that's because the environment is becoming so damaged that our chances of living in good our chances of living in good situations and not having to deal with externalities, certain externalities that will decrease life expectancy, is going up significantly. And then it's the same for income inequality. It's the opportunities for baby boomers to rise up to the top and the American dream and all that good stuff. The chances that you and I will see that dream as opposed to the baby boomers are decreasing. Now, you can give specific examples. Maybe you or I will have that American dream. Who knows? But the chances that we will experience that dream are decreasing. So it's a matter of the overall health of our society, or like our society isn't healthy, and we need to tackle both of these problems at once because they're two symptoms of an unhealthy society and an unstable society. So I don't see why. I guess I'm maybe not fully comprehending what you're saying. I mean, I just in my scheme of things, or the way I conceptualize all this stuff, like it's a necessity that we do both at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think. Okay. I almost want to do like a post-mortem or something where I listen to this whole thing back and then I make notes on all the rabbits I don't chase down the rabbit hole. Because I do want to specifically address what you said, but I also want to address like 8 things what you said, and only one of them is really relevant. So like the 7 I could just like cut off and be like, I think all these things are wrong, but why do that now? Because we are already 40 minutes ish into this episode, and there's a lot I haven't touched that I want to touch. So but I guess my response to the broad point would be, we can fix the environment on a scale that is less overall blunt, right? You have all these people who are experts that are high skilled. They can look at all these specific issues that make up the totality of the problem. They find ways to utilize their resources to fix it. And like with the example of the pollution in the oceans and trash going in the oceans, you can do the kind of like the 80-20 rule, where you look at things and you see where 80% of the problem is coming from, and that's only 80% of the problem. A lot of times comes from about 20% of what's happening. So you can quickly identify, like, here are the main things that are causing this, and here is a very easy way to all of a sudden remove all these parts that are, say, polluting the ocean. And then I have the concern that if we like imagine 20 years ago, if there was a $4 trillion solar project over 10 years to install giant solar panel arrays across Nevada, right? So imagine that happened. We have this huge grid there. Well, the problem is solar panels 20 years ago were a lot less effective than our solar panels now. So you're talking about panels that were significantly less efficient than they are today. So if we do that plan now, it's probably going to be like a much larger increase. Now, so I guess what I'm saying is, imagine that concern where you put up this array and it's very inefficient, but it's all we have. And I'm comparing it from old solar panels to new solar panels. Well, imagine if we did this like trillions of dollars jobs program where a bunch of people go in and they put all these new solar panels for our standards in. And then if we just, put a huge amount of money into high-end research, we found either a new type of battery that works to store energy significantly better and is compatible, or we find that there's a safer way to use, like geothermal energy that can be scaled upwards to apply to society in a way more cost-effective way. So then it's kind of like, well, we can sink all this labor and time in there that is being traded off because all those people could have done different jobs in different sectors. But at least we're doing something. That's kind of why people push for it now, because it's something, and that's the best we know now. And I'm not convinced that's really a great reason to do it. Now, what I was going to say to address your point on income inequality specifically was, I was going to say, I'd almost rather these high skilled people try to solve these big problems because all we know right now is how to put in more stuff that isn't scalable and hope we do enough of it. But I'm not convinced that's really the true way forward in the long run. So what I would rather is, if income inequality is such a problem, I would rather just UBI give everybody, $2,000 a month, and then have like the real experts. I want them to look at this problem because I feel like we could have better solutions if we mobilize them. And then in 10 years, you can mobilize the labor force. It's like, I don't see why we need to give people jobs for the sake of jobs, because that'll fix some income inequality. Why can't we just do it more efficiently then, and then just give them money to do whatever their passion is, instead of forcing them to do manual labor in the name of environmental science? I guess what I'm saying is, if those are the two problems we want to fix, I'd almost rather just give a bunch of people UBI to fix the income inequality part. And we don't need them, doing a job that's going to be deemed inefficient in 15 years based on the scientific findings we make about scalable energy or other kinds that we're not currently utilizing.
Okay. I almost feel like we're talking past each other. So I guess I have something to say. Then I'm gonna kind of maybe ask you a question, or maybe ask you to clarify something. So there's nothing wrong, or there's nothing wrong with mobilizing or incentivizing or investing in these very high-skilled jobs, the scientists and the engineers that are looking into all the possible energy, all the possible clean energy we could we could use. In fact, that is necessary. So I agree. We do need to mobilize those people. And I noticed you seem to be focusing a lot on the inefficiencies of solar energy, and that's fine. You can poke holes in all these different clean energies, but that's not really the point. I mean, the point is we do need to do research. We do need to figure out what is the most efficient way to what is the most efficient clean energy. But we also, I mean, I almost feel like you're contradicting yourself in some sense, because you're saying, well, clean energy or solar energy has its problems, so I'm not convinced we should bother with it. But then you're saying you were saying, well, it's really great that this guy from India invented this contraption to trap trash so it didn't go into the ocean. So there's nothing wrong with doing small innovations and making small steps in the right direction, even if they're not the big the big step that you're aiming for. We sometimes you got to make those small incremental changes as technological innovation progresses. You tweak it and tweak it and tweak it until you're doing things maybe as efficiently as you can. If we ever if that's even a goal that's reachable, or if maybe it's more that you just have to keep tweaking it forever and ever. But and then I guess I would add, I'm perfectly fine with UBI. I think we should have UBI, actually, but I don't think that UBI. I don't think that undermines my point that we do need to mobilize everybody, including low skill workers, and that just goes back to my general my overall ideal, or my overall goal, to allow for the maximum happiness, the maximum pleasure, or I'm struggling for words here, the maximum fulfillment that everybody can experience, rather than the maximum fulfillment that a small group of people can experience, while the rest of us get less and less of that, less and less of the pie. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, or what I would like you to clarify, is maybe clarify what it is I'm not answering, or what it is I'm not getting. I'm actually not quite sure what the argument you're making is. So I need that fleshed out more before I can respond more effectively.
Okay. So one thing I think I could delve more into is like, so you remember the points I mentioned earlier that Naomi Klein kind of mentioned, and one of them is like energy efficient housing, right? So you put in these windows that better retain heat and keep the cold out better, and you don't have to use as much energy to heat your house and cool your house, right? So if every house in America had this, there'd be like a net energy usage that would lower, right? So it's like, okay, that sounds like an okay idea. Who would do this? Well, we'd mobilize a ton of workers to go into houses, schedule a time, and then they come in and then they replace your windows and your doors, and now your house is more energy efficient. It's a big program, and a ton of people do that for a long time until all these houses are, I guess, outfitted correctly. The point I'm trying to make, though, is although that is a marginal, although there's a marginal gain from that, right? So everybody's house is retains the proper temperature better, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's not a good thing. I'm just saying that change is pretty small. It's not to be compared to like if we all started utilizing a different kind of energy that wasn't as dirty as coal or fossil fuels for 30% of our energy. But the thing is, to do this undertaking, to go into tons of people's houses, install new windows and doors, you're just mobilizing an obscene amount of unskilled labor. But then if you like broaden out the picture and you look at the environmental movement like 20 years down the road, that change is going to be like the smallest sliver, but the labor that's going to go into it is going to be huge, and the costs that go into it are going to be huge. So I guess what I'm saying, I'm not saying they're doing nothing, but I'm just saying in terms of looking at the investments that can be made and the breakthroughs that can be made in terms of other kinds of energy, that improvement by using all this labor is like almost negligible in the big picture. So I guess my concern is, although you can say we're giving these people good jobs to do this thing, after they outfit the houses and that happens for a few years, you either have to find something else for them to do that's also probably going to be marginal, or they're out of their like good job that's been created to fix income inequality. So I feel like I'm not saying it's a complete waste, but I'm saying you're having these people do very, very marginal changes that are okay, but it's kind of for the sake of it to some extent. It's to say we're doing something, and society doesn't even really need that if you get all the rest of the changes. If you get all the rest of the changes, then people will outfit their houses to save money on electricity because it will save them money once those windows get cheap enough. And people will end up buying new houses that have that because that's a good perk anyways. So I'm not convinced that all these things based around actually needing a ton of low-skilled labor are very productive, right? And since they're not very productive, and in the big picture, technological innovation is going to be the really wild game changer, why don't we kind of just give those people enough money so income inequality is not the problem, and then let them do what makes them happy? And if they want to keep working in certain kinds of things, then they can. But it's almost like if we're going to spend all that money, I think we should just do UBI. And the reason why I say that is because I know you agree with it. And it's like, hey, well, if we're going to use government, we want to maximize resources and maximize happiness. I would say, well, then, yeah, we shouldn't do all these manual labor projects that are expensive and very marginal if we could just make everybody happy by spending the same amount of money on everybody. I guess that's a concern. And I know it's like, it requires like a few separations of thought along that argument, but I think it's kind of a valid criticism. Now, if you think what you said before addressed that, and you don't want to dwell on it too much because you think we're missing each other, that I think that's fine too. But if you want to close the loop on that before we move on, I think that's fine.
Okay, so I think we're getting somewhere. When it comes to, I'm reminded of, your argument kind of reminds me of some people who, they think about something like recycling, for example, or buying food that is local and organic. And generally speaking, people would say, well, that's a good thing to buy local. It's a good thing to recycle. On the other hand, some people look at that and say, well, the people that are recycling and buying locally also have, huge SUVs that are guzzling, that are greedily guzzling gasoline, and they what I'm trying to say is there's a way in which people pretend to be involved or pretend to be activists when they're really not. So they do something that makes them feel better, that makes them think that they're really saving the planet, when really they're either doing something that's negligible, or they're acting in other ways which actually counteract the little benefit that they might be producing by recycling and buying locally. I bring that up because it kind of goes back to something else we've kind of been talking about this entire episode, which is we do need to be careful not to put a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. We need to be careful that we aren't doing something that only looks good and makes us feel good, but doesn't actually address the problems that we are facing. We need to be clear-headed. We need to look at these problems head on, and we need to make sure that what we are doing is efficient and will make a bit of difference. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't recycle, but that is something we need to think about. How much benefit does solar energy give as opposed to geothermal energy? That's fine, and I think I would agree with you. But I guess I don't know. I think about things like UBI, and I like the concept of UBI, and I would support it. But I would my attitude to UBI is the same as your attitude to mass mobilization of low-skilled workers. Like, it's a good thing in the moment, perhaps, or it's a good thing in the microcosm, but in the macrocosm, it doesn't actually make much of a difference, and there's really actually bigger issues involved in income inequality and in the way that we view people's economic role in society.
Well, I just want to reiterate once again that I think we should, I guess, probably do something on income inequality specifically, just so we can have like a full, I guess, throated argument about that and where we think that matters, and then maybe even how UBI could play into it could be an element. But I have another example that I think is actually relevant to what we were just saying, and I think it could really hit home, or it could potentially wrap up our thoughts here. And you mentioned like buying locally and buying organically. And one thing that Naomi Klein talks about is she pretty much says free trade is kind of a scourge against the environment because you have so many people mobilizing things to get from one place to another, and that has pollution involved. So you want to minimize that distance from where things are made or food you eat is to it getting into your home. Now, I think this underscores another one of the huge economic parts of the equation that a lot of the people thinking about these issues aren't, I think, properly taking into consideration. So imagine you bought everything locally, and everything you wanted that was made is made near you, and then you bought it from there. So the distance is effectively you driving to a farmer's market a mile away, and the people bringing the food to the farmer's market from 5 miles away. So you didn't burn the amount of energy that is required from, like, say, soybeans to move from China to the United States on a boat, right? So you've now avoided that whole problem. But what happened, right? So you have to think about the differences in costs between the two things, and then you have to imagine if that difference in cost between two small items was then expanded to everything you ever bought in your life. And then you have to think about all the things you can't get now because you're only buying locally, and not everything would be produced close to you. So there's those trade-offs you'd have to make. And I think Naomi Klein is I think she kind of takes the argument where I guess the position you're taking and AOC's position to the whole next level, because she pretty much openly will say that we need a complete paradigm shift, and it's not really even about she wouldn't even say she's a proponent of a bunch of kinds of energies because she almost considers them unnatural. And is almost saying we need to shift into a paradigm that almost reverts us closer to what humanity originally was, because we've just been a disruptive force. But I guess to come back to free trade specifically, you have to imagine all these new costs you're incurring. Imagine if you didn't incur those costs, and then the money that everybody, if you want to think in collective terms, collectively saved was then allocated towards the very specific thing that makes the most change, like research. So imagine you still bought things in the way you wanted to, but then everybody was taxed more. So you still have this good quality of living of being able to buy pasta for $1. But then all of it was taken off the top. And instead of it being, instead of the money, instead of the environmental benefit being everything's moved closer to you, it's we tax all those, what those gains would have been, and then we give it all to researchers who are really smart and will make a breakthrough that will just resolve these issues. And I think that that's just really the way to go. And I think that has much more potential than it being like, because to expand on why the mobilization of resources or of people is so scary to me is because it's not even that what they do is marginal, because marginal changes are important. The problem is they cost the most too. So like, imagine there's an $8 trillion plan. It's like, well, most of it would be done on the research front, which could be like $1 trillion of it. But then it would cost like tons of money to mobilize all these people and give them jobs indefinitely. And that's why I pushed back, because I wouldn't push back on doing certain marginal beneficial things if the cost was reflective of how it's only marginally beneficial. But since the cost isn't, right, you have to employ a whole sector, and then the other thing is when you employ a whole sector, those people aren't doing jobs like producing things people want. So you've now priced up all the industry, and now a bunch of companies can't start because they wouldn't be able to sell something enough to now justify higher employee costs, right? So you've now priced out a ton of low margin businesses. You've now made everything cost more because this has happened. So I guess that's all I guess that's the final level of the argument I'm making on the topic of mobilizing labor. So if you want to respond, but maybe not double down on talking about the problems of income inequality and keep it maybe related to environmentalism, maybe if you want to, or you don't have to. Feel free, and then maybe we can move on to like the last couple points.
Well, that kind of. Well, this would really be a topic for another episode. How far down the environmentalism rabbit hole do we go down? Because you have people. There are people called anarcho-primitivists who basically say, we need to abandon this technological society and go back to, hunter-gatherer tribes. I don't think that would be fair to quite characterize. I wouldn't characterize Naomi Klein as an anarcho-primitivist, but point being, that's another thing that we all need to think about. What kind of how far can we lean in towards or how far can we go down technological innovation and but how far or in what ways can technology be detrimental to life on Earth? But I guess I want to change topics slightly, and I want to talk a little bit about who has this burden of clean energy the most, because you introduced me to a episode of Common Knowledge, in which hold on, I'm trying to find his name. Do you remember his name?
His name is Bjon Lomberg.
Bjon Lomberg.
Yeah.
He was interviewed by Peter Robinson on Uncommon Knowledge. And I think he wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist or something like that. And he brought up a good point. He said that it would be immoral to force low or poor countries to solely focus on green energy or clean energy, because they already struggle some with getting resources and to people and allowing people to have a certain standard of living. I completely agree with him, but maybe not. So perhaps the policies he and I would disagree about, but I completely agree in one sense, because when it comes to green energy, when it comes to implementing green energy and and slowly decreasing fossil fuels over time, the burden is on the United States. The burden is on the United Kingdom. The burden is on France. These very rich, powerful countries who have already post-industrial countries. They've been through their industrial revolution. So it is necessary. And this isn't to say that clean energy shouldn't be invested in these poor countries. Actually, if you look at a lot of the evidence, a lot of these poor countries, they're doing the most to invest in clean energy, and they're actually doing it quite effectively. But the point still remains true that I'm less concerned about the carbon footprint emitted by Haiti than I am the carbon footprint emitted by the United States. The rich countries, they have more wiggle room. They have the ability to decrease their carbon footprint enormously, and to do so with clean energy. And what is unfortunate to me is we're really not doing that. Now we are doing it somewhat. I'm not saying we've done nothing, or those countries I mentioned have done nothing, but we're not doing we're not implementing the systemic change that we need to, because people seem to be stuck in the past where, well, we've always done. We've always had these coal jobs, that's what Trump was, and Mitch McConnell, they say, we're going to keep your jobs. We're going to bring back those jobs in coal. No, that is so wrong, and that upsets me. We need to be the innovators in clean energy. We can't afford to take a back seat on this, because these poor countries don't have the resources to completely get off fossil fuels, and that's not their fault. And it is the responsibility of these rich countries to implement clean energy as much as possible and as quickly as possible, because we've done the most damage to the environment. These poor countries that are just beginning to industrialize in the late 20th, early 21st century, they have not done a lot of damage to the environment, at least not to the scale that the rich countries have done to the environment. So that's my little rant.
Okay,
go ahead.
So how does it make you feel that usually energy prices are it's kind of regressive, right? So if energy costs more in the United States because we shift to things that are cleaner but they're more expensive, then the people who are kind of most screwed are going to be poor people. Now, if I want to, here's the thing, and I would expect to say, well, it shouldn't fall on the poor people, right? It should fall on the richer people that can afford it. Ideally, the people in charge would make those costs fall on them. But then I can say, okay, well, China's a huge polluter. And the thing is, China has like a lot of poor people, and I wouldn't expect them to do it right. So if China did a bunch of green if China invested in a lot of green infrastructure, like we would think, okay, that's a good thing because their pollution levels are going down. But then we're discounting the fact that the people who bear the costs of paying this higher price for energy would be a lot of Chinese people that are, well, it would be the Chinese people who are buying it. And the people who are most, I guess, who have the tightest budgets are poor people. So then they suffer the most when energy prices go up, but shifting to greener energy is going to kind of inevitably do that, because the reason why we use dirty energy is because it's cheaper. Now, I guess I'll throw in the comment, because I kind of suspect that we should go there anyways, and I want to bring it up anyways, is historically we have underpriced the cost of, say, oil and coal, because we don't make them take into account the fact that they are pollutants when we use them. And I think that's bad. But you also have to remember that we subsidize green energies as well. So if we unsubsidized, all of them to take into account, like if oil and coal had to, had to actually cost its real cost, right? And had to pay people for the fact that's polluted. And then you took away the subsidies for green things to make it all even, it would still drive the energy prices up. So I guess what I'm kind of saying is, if you shift to green things, it's going to cost more. And those kinds of costs are the kinds of costs that are aggressive. And when you think about countries outside of the US, like China, that pollute a lot and have a ton of people, and a lot of poor people would probably be hurt by them switching to green energy, like what is your reaction to that? Because I'm like kind of acutely aware of how the second you make energy cost more, it's going to hurt impoverished people. And you could say, well, the biggest polluters are these rich countries. It's like, well, China's a huge country, and there are a lot of wealthy people there. But just like in the United States, there's also a lot of poor people here and a lot of poor people there. And it's not as easy to just assume that China would, be fair about those bills increasing like you can imagine the U.S. being, right? So you're going to have a lot of people whose standard of living kind of drops through the floor if China did something green. So I guess how does addressing the regressive the regressive nature of energy costs, like how do you think that plays into anything at all? Because you can say there are rich countries, but there's poor people in the rich countries.
I need you to rephrase the question. I'm not quite following what you're saying.
Energy prices are regressive because because poor people have less disposable income, and a lot of their income goes towards paying bills. So if energy costs more because it's greener, and even if that falls on people in rich countries, there are poor people in rich countries, and the people who will be most squeezed by this are poor people trying to pay their bills, even though they live in rich countries. For the U.S., it's easy to say we just subsidize them, but like China and maybe other countries that are somewhat wealthy compared to Africa, I don't think you could necessarily assume the same would happen. So this is like I guess is a trade-off that has to be reckoned with. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because, yeah, I don't know if that was any better. Sorry.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I don't live in China. I can't. I have very little sway with Chinese policy. Now, I know you could say to me, well, Matthew, you don't really have any sway in U.S. policy either. But I have far more control and sway of U.S. policy than I do Chinese policy. Now, and I know you disagree with that, but that's my piece said. And so I am less worried about. I mean, I could say a couple things. I mean, I am concerned about what the U.S. can do in and of itself. I want the U.S. to do what it can do to invest in green and subsidize green energy, and I want to make sure the U.S. Addresses that issue, so poor people are not completely sidelined just because we're trying to get in green energy. And then another thing is we can, as in the international stage, we can pressure these countries to subsidize green energy, and we can pressure these countries to not ruin the lives of their poor people just because we have to go to green energy. But here's, I mean, we have to though. That's the thing. It's not a question of, oh, should we go to green energy? We have to do it, and we have to do it now. I mean, and I know people would say, well, now you're just being an alarmist. I'm going to ignore you. But there's, I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, it's just a necessary step we have to make. It's a necessary step we have to make if we want to maintain a fulfilling standard of living that so many people like now. And then I would add, if we invest more in if we invest more in public transportation, if we invest more, or if we encourage people more to, say, ride a bike to work rather than drive a car to work, or take the bus to work rather than drive a car to work, that would decrease people's necessity on on this energy. Because if you take a bus to work every day, your carbon footprint is far less than if you take a car, because the bus is going to have, I don't know, 10 people on it. And if those each 10 people are driving a car to work, that is an exponentially greater level of CO2 you're entering into the atmosphere than if you go on a bus. Or it's obviously far less if you ride a bike. So yeah, if we can better serve, or if we can invest more in public transportation, then I think that would offset the cost of energy, because we could use less of it.
So to some degree, I'm unsatisfied with myself, because I think I anticipated you to make different points than the ones you're making. And the ones you're making, I feel like I have a lot to say on, but I thought my points were going to tie in better with yours, right? So I thought I was going to, but to address your points, I feel like I either have to forgo some other things I want to say, or I need to like go down a whole rabbit hole that I'm not sure I want to go down. But I guess I'll say this. I generally have a problem with this kinds of thinking, because I think people overstate how much of an effect you're having. And then I think people understate the cost it is to make that change in your own life, right? So you often hear people talk about eating meat, and it's like, oh, if you eat meat like one less time a week, that is a positive change for this reason. And it's like, okay, like that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I guess it might not be that good. It might not be that big of a deal to forgo meat like once a week. I don't eat meat every day. But when you say things like, okay, well, if you take a bike or take the bus, well, it's like the reason why somebody might not be taking a bus or their bike is because it's inconvenient. So when you start asking people to make these trade-offs that are very, very, very marginal in terms of the environment, they're often like pretty inconvenient to people's routines. It's like, okay, well, you lose, 30 extra minutes of your life on your commute every day to take the bus, but you're doing some sort of good for the environment that is minuscule. And what I kind of say is, instead of doing all these things that are like technically true and could add up if like literally everybody did them, but I'm not convinced that there's a reason to suspect that even a large amount of people would do them, is because the real changes are going to be groundbreaking things that need high skilled minds, engineering or trying to review the science and then testing new things and seeing the very specific things that are screwing up our environment the most, and then targeting those, because it's kind of like asking people to make these trade-offs in their own life that could make their own life worse. And I'm almost done. And their day-to-day, routines harder or more. You're losing time when you could be spending with your family regularly. And it's like and it's kind of like, well, we have to do something, and it's something, but it's like maybe the something isn't on every individual. Maybe the something is on specific individuals that are very precise and very smart to figure out something specific, and that will do way more than what even 200,000 people all making the same trade-off that's inconvenient, doing, right? So I guess it makes me push back on that line of thought. And even Naomi Klein kind of rejects that kind of thought, that these small changes are really worth even thinking of. It's not just me, but it's because she pushes for different kinds of broad policies, and I push for more money, I guess, on narrow ones if we were going to do things with the government.
Okay, I think I'm beginning to understand the difference between you and I. I have an issue with. I'm going to try to characterize your argument, and feel free to interrupt me if I'm doing it incorrectly. So this is what I hear you saying. I hear you saying what we really need to focus on is investing in scientists and engineers. We need to focus less on things like recycling or transportation or public transportation. We really need to invest the money that we would invest in all those marginal changes or marginal benefits. We need to really invest it in technological innovation, because that is what is going to change society for the better. Is that a good characterization of what you're trying to say?
Yeah, that's pretty right. Yeah.
You sound a bit skeptical.
Well, it's just like I would add certain qualifications, like or use like certain other kinds of energy, right? Instead of sticking to solar and wind, I guess. I yeah, I think I'll know if I've been represented correctly when I hear your counter argument and see what part of that you kind of take apart. But I think I agree with the characterization.
Okay. What I would disagree with your characterization or your interpretation of this is I don't think we can. I don't think we can kind of just live our lives under the motto of, well, it's business as usual. We have those scientists, those engineers. In a word, we have technocrats. They're gonna work on this technological innovation. It's gonna be great. In 50 years or so, they're gonna have to have it figured out, and this is what we're gonna have to do, and we're gonna do it just because it's gonna make sense economically. But until then, we got to just do what we're doing now. We just got to live our lives the way we do now, because no one can be bothered to ride a bike to work or take the bus. People can't be bothered to put solar panels on their roof on their house because it's just inefficient. We just got to do we continue doing what we're doing while these technocrats figure it all out. And I am very skeptical of that train of thought. I'm very skeptical of that reasoning because, and again, I'm not trying to sound eschatological here. I'm not trying to say, oh, it's the end of the world, but I am trying to say that climate change is a serious problem, and it needs to be it needs to be fought. It needs to be dealt with on multiple levels. We do need to have technocrats doing the number crunching and running experiments and building machines. We do need people. We do need people to tweak their lives in ways which will benefit, will decrease carbon emissions. We need all of those things and more. And so I almost disagree with you and Melanie Klein at the same time in that sense. It's not an either or proposition. We need small change and we need technological innovation. We cannot we cannot continue doing what we're doing, because that is what is destroying the prospects of our descendants. That is what is going to lead to lives that I don't even want to think about. If we just continue what we're doing, just keep burning fossil fuels because of all the reasons that someone could give, it is going to end very badly, not only for other species but for the human race. So it's just a existential necessity that we do big and small changes. And I just I'm going to hammer this home. That's the hill I'm going to die on. That is what we have to do if we want to lead. If we want to lead lives that are anything like the lives we lead right now.
Okay, I mean, you're very entitled to your perspective, and I don't think I'm going to. I don't think I'm going to get you to flip on that, especially in this conversation alone. I guess I would go as far as to say that it's not even that I'm just trying to be efficient. It's that I think when I focus on the small things, I almost think that's focusing on the big things, because I think that's focusing on the real issue at hand and truly tackling it in almost I don't want to say a timeless manner, but in a long-term manner. And I think doing the things now that everybody's like kind of calling on, and all of these things that are easy for the public conscious to understand, almost they almost seem so inconsequential, because I don't think they will be grasping any innovation they would make in the future. And that innovation is what's actually going to make these policies successful. I think I would even go as far to say, if somebody wanted to if the government wanted to throw $5 trillion at the problem, and they said, yeah, we do 1 trillion in research and 4 trillion in all these big things now, I would probably even say, no, you should just put 5 in like the research. You should flood the research with as much money as you want, because if you put enough money in it and literally everybody wants a piece of that cake because they want all that money, then we'll actually solve climate change as the issue. If that's how the statist wants to, conceptualize it, that their intervention is. Now, I'm not really defending now, because I think the current status quo is caused by a ton of market distortions. So as I stated earlier, I don't think people are paying the amount they should pay for dirty energies, because I don't think it takes into account that those things are using our pollutants. And the way I would address that is by you know it from the ANCAP, it's doubling down on property rights. And it's the fact is, you could have people essentially have to pay for the amount they pollute, not through, I guess, a carbon tax, but by buying credits that you can pollute a certain amount with a credit, and everybody would be entitled to a certain amount, pretty much based on either the amount of property they own or them as a person, given the place they live. How many credits would be attributed to maybe this county, and you're a person, so you have this much credit. And then a bunch of companies would want to buy it, but not everybody has to sell it, and then all those factors and all those prices would take into account people's how much they were willing to pollute. And then when you go and buy gas, it would take into account these true costs instead of no costs that has been added. And then you can act accordingly. Because now if gas costs way more, because people will only sell their share at a very high price, then people are going to take their bike because they don't want to spend that much to drive to work, right? Or people are going to carpool, because then you can spend a quarter of the gas to get 4 people to the same place. So I think there are a lot of distortions on that front that lead to us overpolluting. I think I mentioned this on the podcast, but the fact that my city takes care of my trash definitely incentivizes all kinds of waste, right? Because I don't have to pay somebody to take the amount of trash I have based on the pound. It's just whatever I throw away that the city comes and takes based on taxes. So if I throw away 10 bags of trash next week, or if I throw away 2, doesn't matter. The cost doesn't affect me. So I'll buy things that are overly packaged. I have no incentive as a consumer to care that things are packaged in a way that is environmentally friendly. All these financial distortions have happened because, in my mind, a lot of them are because of government, right? I have no incentive to keep my trash low, other than the virtue of knowing that I was a good environmentalist today, right? And that's a lot less than having to pay for my trash based on how much my trash weighs, and then buying products that are bulky. So, or if knowing that I'd actually have maybe a financial incentive to recycle certain things. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not saying the status quo is great. I'm saying we've set up an incentive structure that sets up a ton of pollution, and it's understandable why people act in terms of these incentives. You pretty much only make your life harder if you want to do the right thing. And that's why I would say people should be incentivized for doing the right things. And the way you do that is you double down on, you have your property, and all these things ruin your property. So you either have to buy extra shares of it that people have to consent to selling you, or something of that sort, right? So I would lean into it in a lot of ways if I'm putting my ANCAP hat on and taking off my statist hat. And then, and as you know, my statist hat is, oh yeah, just throw 5 trillion at researchers. But I did want to get that point in, and I guess because we're hitting on time, I just wanted to comment on the John Oliver bit we watched. I actually was kind of disappointed in that John Oliver bit, because he only talked about the carbon tax, and I liked it to some extent, because the carbon tax is correctly acknowledging that incentives are huge in this issue, right? You need to think about the incentives we're setting up. So he acknowledged that by bringing in Bill 9, and they kind of made a joke about it. But I was actually disappointed in it, because the thing that I guess makes the most sense to humans intuition to just think, yeah, these incentive structures are bad. Let's have a good incentive structure. But then he downplays like all my kind of questions about, is it smart to mobilize a bunch of people to do things that might not actually be efficient? He really only talked about that incentive problem, which I don't think is entirely off base. I would just privatize it instead of making it a carbon tax. So I think those are the last of my thoughts. And I know we're pushing on well over an hour at this point. So feel free to refute everything I say. And maybe I won't get a last word in, and maybe we'll wrap up after. It depends if I get triggered or not. I know I said a lot there, and you can unpack as much or as little as you desire.
Yeah, you said so much. It's hard to know what to comment on and what to leave for another day. I guess I'll say a little bit about so we've been talking about the Green New Deal, or at least that was ostensibly what the conversation is about. We didn't actually tackle a lot about what it said in and of itself, the Green New Deal. Did a little bit, not too much.
Can I make a quick comment on that? I actually was reading it, and a lot of the Green New Deal language is kind of, I think we touched on. We pretty much covered it, even though we weren't directly talking about it. Because a lot of it was like, I guess conservatives would say it's dropping the mask, but a lot of it was kind of like, hey, we want to tackle income inequality too. Here are some jobs that would maybe do that, right? So I think we did do a good job covering it. If somebody read through it and then listened to what we'd have to say, I think we addressed a lot of it.
Point being, I want to bring up the something from history. I want to bring up the New Deal, because this is named after the New Deal. It's called the Green New Deal, obviously. And I just want to speak a little bit about the New Deal. So this might trigger you, so forgive me. But the United States was in a depression, an out-and-out depression. We might be facing that in the near future. Who knows? I'm not necessarily qualified to say. But the world was doing very poorly economically, and it was pretty obvious to anyone looking at the situation that the U.S., and I'm talking about the U.S. specifically because that's the country I know best, the U.S. could really go down one of two paths. The U.S. could go towards the German model under Hitler, so it could become fascist, so it could become a centralized government that is basically controls everything about your life, and controls the economy and all that good stuff. Or it could have followed the Soviet model. So it could have become Marxist-Leninist, and that would have been very. I mean, and that would be similar to fascism in some ways, but very different from fascism in other ways. But the point being, that was like those were like seemed to be like the two options that could happen in the state in the United States because because of the failure of the state and the failure of the market to properly allocate resources. And then FDR, who was not a model human being, he had a lot of flaws. He got involved in scandals. So I'm not here to say he was Jesus, but what did FDR do? FDR basically went against his own class interest. If we want to be kind of Marxist about it, he basically said, well, look, the U.S. could be torn apart, or the U.S. could go to one of two extremes. I don't want that. I don't want to become fascist or communist. I want to find a way. You could almost call it a middle path. I want to find a middle path to which keeps a certain amount of free market capitalism involved, but it also uses the government to deal with externalities and uses the government to make sure that people have food on the table and people have a job to go to. and it worked. Now, I mean, and you know, so and you can there. I'm not saying that it was perfect. I'm not saying that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of problems now. A lot of the problems the U.S. has now, in fact, are because we have gone away from the more FDR style approach, and we've veered away from that, and we've kind of repudiated certain. We become, you know, neoliberal corporatists, which is not quite what FDR had envisioned. You know, the funny thing about someone like Bernie Sanders, people are like, "Oh my God, Bernie Sanders is a crazy socialist." Well, no, he's not. If you took Bernie Sanders and you put him in the room with FDR, or you put him in the room with General Eisenhower, they would be like, "Oh yeah, he's just a mainstream center-left Democrat." Like, yeah, that's obvious. So I just want to kind of make it clear that a type of we need legislation like that. We need to mobilize society. We need to drastically change the way we're doing things, or once again, it will lead to horrible human cost. So, you know, so it's called the Green New Deal, and I think that is important because not only do we need to address, the issues of climate change, whether we don't necessarily agree on how to address it, but we agree we need to address it. We also need to address the man's economic role, and I'll just, I guess, say one more thing. I think the breakthrough that FDR the breakthrough that FDR had, for all his flaws, was that he realized that in the United States we have a Bill of Rights, right? So technically, whether you agree with the state as a concept or whatever, you can say, okay, well, technically the state says you can't go to jail for your freedom of speech. You have the right to set freedom of assembly, freedom of having a gun, freedom of religion. Those things are pretty much are pretty they're pretty consistent. I mean, there's some, hedging your bets, and there's some tweaking, and it's not perfect, but generally speaking, you have those freedoms. What FDR said was, we need an economic Bill of Rights. The market can't just do everything for you. You need to allow people to have a certain, I think it's called equality of opportunity. That is what we need. We need equality of opportunity. Forget about equality of outcome. That's a caricature. We need equality of opportunity. And that's what people who are supporting the Green New Deal, that's what people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, etc., that's what they are fighting for. And that's what I think we need to fight for in our present circumstances.
Okay. I mean, if I wanted to respond to that, we'd be going 10 more minutes. And by my loose approximation, this is probably like already the longest episode, which I don't even know how we managed to pull that off, because I don't even feel like we necessarily tackled too much. So everything you said springs up three ideas for me of topics that we actually need to, the three topics we actually need to wrestle with, and I'm only going to be a little provocative when I say these three issues. So the first one is income inequality. The second idea is stimulus, or how I wrote it down in my notes, why stimulus is bad, and then in parentheses, why the New Deal didn't get us out of the Great Depression, and to also trigger Republicans, I'd also say, and how World War II also didn't get us out of the Great Depression. Because spending your whole economy into shooting bullets at other people isn't actually good for the average person. And in terms of, it just looks good in terms of GDP, which is why people say that. And then the third one would be the concept of the economic Bill of Rights. And I will just shortly, I guess, say the potentially provocative statement that at least the Bill of Rights is all freedoms from government on these 10 things. And the economic Bill of Rights would be how a government can guarantee these economic rights that FDR and other people philosophized about. So I guess it's needless to underscore that even though I'm not going to kind of like give a detailed pushback on that, we still do have our differences. And then I think one of the good things about this episode was we quickly encountered a lot of practical differences. And typically we've been running into a lot of fundamental and we've been getting derailed by very fundamental points that we disagree on. We'll be like, oh, well, Matt doesn't like this issue because we're falling back on the whole collectivism thing. Then we do an episode on collectivism and we're like, we're running into the social contract. And then it's like all these abstract things. And then right now we're saying things and it's like, well, we're talking about environmental policy, but I think we're really getting bogged down in how to resolve income inequality, to what extent income inequality is a problem, and how like the best ways to deal with this are, or how stimulus actually interacts with the economy, and what we think the results of that would be, and things of that sort. So I think that gives us some rabbit holes we can dig an hour into, and we could talk about that off air. But otherwise, I don't think I was too provocative there. So I think, are you okay with me wrapping up now? Or do you want to yell a little bit? Okay. So I think we're done yelling at each other. I think that was a fun one. I hope
I'll yell after we stop recording.
Okay, that's my favorite thing is the second we turn off the recording, it is just the decency drops, that the masks drop. I start screaming words that cannot be said in a civilized society, and then Matt either responds and the like, or is deeply distraught for my for my antics. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope I at least made some somewhat compelling arguments. I wasn't like big spending bad because big spending bad, because that's what you hear from congressmen. And then you hear, good jobs are good. We like good paying jobs. And it's like, okay, guys, can you talk a little more? And that's why the show is called Beyond Talking Points. So I hope you guys enjoyed. You can watch the video version on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points. And then you can find the podcast on all of our podcatchers. So like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all that good stuff. We'll be covering a lot more stuff in the upcoming weeks, it sounds like. And I hope you guys enjoyed. So signing off, it's Matt and Matt.